So before we talk about sort of explore the different ideas underlying interactive artificial intelligence, which we are working on, let me just go along this thread to skip to kind of our world of social media, which is something that, at least on the artificial intelligence side, you think about. There's a popular narrative, I don't know if it's true, but that we have these silos in social media and we have these clusterings, as you're kind of mentioning. And the idea is that along that narrative is that we want to break each other out of those silos so we can be empathetic to other people. To if you're a Democrat, you're empathetic to the Republican. If you're a Republican, you're empathetic Democrat. Those are just two silly bins that we seem to be very excited about. But there's other binnings that we can think about. Is there, from an artificial intelligence perspective, because you're just saying we cluster along the data, but then interactive artificial intelligence is referring to throwing agents into that mix, AI systems into that mix, helping us, interacting with us humans, and maybe getting us out of those silos. Is that something that you think is possible? Do you see a hopeful possibility for artificial intelligence systems in these large networks of people to get us outside of our habits in at least the idea space, to where we can sort of be empathetic to other people's lived experiences, other people's points of view, all that kind of stuff?
Yes, and I actually don't think it's that hard. Well, it's not hard in this sense. So imagine that you can. Let's make life simple for a minute. Let's assume that you can do a kind of partial ordering over ideas or clusterings of behavior. It doesn't even matter what I mean here, so long as there's some way that this is a cluster, there's some edge between them, right? And there's kind of, they don't quite touch even, or maybe they come very close. If you can imagine that conceptually, then the way you get from here to here is not by going from here to here. The way you get from here to here is you find the edge and you move slowly together, right? And I think that machines are actually very good at that sort of thing once we can kind of define the problem, either in terms of behavior or ideas or words or whatever. So it's easy in the sense that if you already have the network, and you know the relationships, the edges and sort of the strengths on them, and you kind of have some semantic meaning for them. The machine doesn't have to. You do as the designer. Then yeah, I think you can kind of move people along and sort of expand them. But it's harder than that. And the reason it's harder than that, or sort of coming up with the network structure itself is hard, is because I'm going to tell you a story that someone else told me. And I may get some of the details a little bit wrong, but it roughly goes like this. You take two sets of people from the same backgrounds, and you want them to solve a problem. So you separate them up, which we do all the time, right? Oh, we're going to break out groups. You're going to go over there and you're going to talk about this. You're going to go over there and talk about this. And then you have them sort of in this big room, but far apart from one another. And you have them sort of interact with one another. When they come back to talk about what they learned, you want to merge what they've done together. It can be extremely hard because they basically don't speak the same language anymore. Like when you create these problems and you dive into them, you create your own language. So the example this one person gave me, which I found kind of interesting because we were in the middle of that at the time, was they're sitting over there and they're talking about these rooms that you can see, but you're seeing them from different vantage points depending upon which side of the room you're on. They can see a clock very easily. And so they start referring to the room as the one with the clock. This group over here, looking at the same room, they can see the clock, but it's, not in their line of sight or whatever. So they end up referring to it by some other way. When they get back together and they're talking about things, they're referring to the same room and they don't even realize they're referring to the same room. And in fact, this group doesn't even see that there's a clock there, and this group doesn't see whatever. The clock on the wall was the thing that stuck with me. So if you create these different silos, the problem isn't that the ideologies disagree. It's that you're using the same words and they mean radically different things. The hard part is just getting them to agree on maybe we'd say the axioms in our world, right? But, just get them to agree on some basic definitions. Because right now they're talking past each other, just completely talking past each other. That's the hard part. Getting them to meet, getting them to interact, that may not be that difficult. Getting them to see where their language is leading them to lead past one another, that's the hard part.
It's a really interesting question to me. It could be on the layer of language, but it feels like there's multiple layers to this. Like it could be worldview. It could be, it all boils down to empathy, being able to put yourself in the shoes of the other person, to learn the language, to learn like visually how they see the world, to learn like the I mean, I experienced this now with trolls. The degree of humor in that
Mhm.
world. For example, I talk about love a lot. I'm very like uh, I'm really lucky to have this amazing community of loving people. But whenever I encounter trolls, they always roll their eyes at the idea of love because it's so
Mhm.
quote unquote cringe.
Yeah.
So they show love by like derision, I would say, and I think about on the human level, that's a whole nother discussion. That's psychology, that's sociology, so on. But I wonder if AI systems can help somehow and to bridge the gap of what is this person's life like? Encourage me to just ask that question, to put myself in their shoes, to experience the agitations, the fears, the hopes they have, the to experience, to even just to think about what was their upbringing like having a single parent home or a shitty education or all those kinds of things, just to put myself in that mind space. It feels like that's really important for us to bring those clusters together to find that similar language, but it's unclear how AI can help that because it seems like AI systems need to understand both parties first.
So the word understand there is doing a lot of work, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
do you have to understand it, or do you just simply have to note that there is something similar and as a point to touch, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, you use the word empathy, and I like that word for a lot of reasons. I think you're right in the way that you're using it, the way that you're describing it, but let's separate it from sympathy, right? So, sympathy is feeling sort of for someone. Empathy is kind of understanding where they're coming from and how they feel, right? And for most people, those things go hand in hand. For some people, some are very good at empathy and very bad at sympathy. Some people cannot experience. Well, my observation would be, I'm not a psychologist. My observation would be that some people seem incapable of feeling sympathy unless they feel empathy first. You can understand someone, understand where they're coming from, and still think, no, I can't support that.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't mean that the only way I because if that isn't the case, then what it requires is that you must the only way that you can to understand someone means you must agree with everything that they do, which isn't
Right.
right, right? And
Right.
and if the only way I can feel for someone is to completely understand them and make them like me in some way, well, then we're lost, right? Because we're not all exactly like each other. I don't have to understand everything that you've gone through. It helps clearly, but they're separable ideas, right? Even though they get clearly tangled up in one another. So what I think AI could help you do actually is and I'm being quite fanciful, as it were. But if you think of these as kind of, I understand how you interact, the words that you use, the actions you take. I have some way of doing this. Let's not worry about what that is. But I can see you as a kind of distribution of experiences and actions taken upon you, things you've done, and so on. And I can do this with someone else, and I can find the places where there's some kind of commonality, a mapping, as it were, even if it's not total. If I think of it as distribution, right, then I can take the cosine of the angle between you, and if it's if it's 0, you've got nothing in common. If it's 1, you're completely the same person. Well, you're probably not 1. You're almost certainly not 0. If I can find the place where there's the overlap, then I might be able to introduce you on that basis or connect you in that way, and make it easier for you to take that step of empathy. It's not impossible to do, although I wonder if it requires that everyone involved is at least interested in asking the question. So maybe the hard part is just getting them interested in asking the question. In fact, maybe if you can get them to ask the question, how are we more alike than we are different, they'll solve it themselves. Maybe that's the problem that AI should be working on, not telling you how you're similar or different, but just getting you to decide that it's worthwhile asking the question.
So no.
It feels like an economist's answer, actually.
Well, first of all, people like it when I would disagree. So let me disagree slightly, which is, I think everything you said is brilliant, but I tend to believe, philosophically speaking, that people are interested underneath it all. And I would say that AI, the possibility that an AI system would show the commonality is incredible. That's a really good starting point. I would say if on social media, I could discover the common things, deep or shallow, between me and a person who there's tension with.
Mm-hmm.
I think that my basic human nature would take over from there. And I think enjoy that commonality. And like, there's something sticky about that my mind will linger on. and that person in my mind will become like warmer and warmer, and like I'll start to feel more and more compassion towards them. I think for majority of the population that's true, but that might be that's a hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, it's an empirical question, right? You'd
Right.
have to figure it out. I mean, I want to believe you're right, and so I'm going to say that I think you're right. Of course, some people come to those things for the purpose of trolling, right? And it doesn't matter. They're playing a different game.
Yeah.
But I don't know. My experience is it requires two things. It requires, in fact, maybe this is really at the end what you're saying, and I do agree with this for sure. So it's hard to hold on to that kind of anger or to hold on to just a desire to humiliate someone for that long. It's just
Right.
difficult to do. It takes a toll on you. But more importantly, we know this both from people having done studies on it, but also from our own experiences, that it is much easier to be dismissive of a person if they're not in front of you, if they're not real, right? So much of the history of the world is about making people other, right? So if you're on social media, if you're on the web, if you're doing whatever in the internet, being forced to deal with someone as a person, some equivalent to being in the same room, makes a huge difference because then you're forced to deal with their humanity because it's in front of you. The other is, of course, that they might punch you in the face if you go too far. So both of those things kind of work together, I think, to the right end. So I think bringing people together is really a kind of substitute for forcing them to see the humanity in another person and to not be able to treat them as bits. It's hard to troll someone when you're looking them in the eye. This is very difficult to do.
Agreed.